Hello guys, welcome back. It's good to see you again. Hey, last time we talked about the Battle of Britain and the Blitz of 1940 and how Winston Churchill and his oratory skills, along with the perseverance, the spirit of the civilians of London and the RAF bombers, are able to push aside, push back, defeat the Germans in the Battle of Britain. So 1941, we see Hitler now turn his focus to the USSR. Now, as you recall, he made a pact with Soviet Russia and Stalin back in '39. He's going to turn his back on that pact. The date's going to be June 22nd, 1941. I'll say it again. June 22nd, 1941, known today as Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa, which means red, it's an attack on the Red Army and Soviet Russia, becomes the largest land attack in history. 3.2 million German troops crossed the frontier into Western USSR, June 22nd, 1941. Now, on the surface, it really appeared that all factors were weighing against the USSR. Germany had all the advantages stacked in their deck, and really the USSR was in a really bad place as this conflict begins in June of '41. A couple of things to mention and note about where Russia was during this time period. First of all, you had an issue with the depression of Joseph Stalin, a very real situation. So the fact that one, Stalin's an egomaniac, but two, that he was tricked, he was duped by Hitler. He thought they had a deal in the Nazi-Soviet Pact, and now clearly Hitler has turned his back on him. So for the first several months of the conflict, Stalin is depressed, he's unable to make a decision clearly. So it's a major factor for the USSR as this whole conflict begins. Secondly, I should mention as well that during the 30s, Joseph Stalin had 35,000 of his Red Army officers purged or just flat out killed during a series of mock trials. He felt they were not loyal to the Bolshevik Party enough, or to him, Joseph Stalin, so he had all of his men killed during this time period. It really put them in a bad way because you had people who were maybe corporals or captains or lower level officers now running the army in place of the 35,000 generals who were killed a couple years prior. Thirdly, the USSR and the Red Army was largely inexperienced. The past several years, they weren't fighting at all. And of course, what had Germany been doing since 1936 involved in some form of conflict. So at this point in time, Germany was a fairly well-oiled machine compared to the inexperience of Russia. And of course, number four, always a problem dating back to World War I, and prior to that, lack of weaponry, lack of supplies for Russia, for the USSR. So guys, as I said again, the battle begins 6/22/1941. Now, it's interesting because Hitler, being the student he was, had studied extensively about Napoleon's invasion back in 1812 of Russia. And he really thought long and hard about ways to avoid the pitfalls that had plagued the Napoleonic campaign in the USSR or Russia back then. Given all this preparation and all the things he thought through closely and clearly prior to 6/22/41, he knew he had to leave early because of the severity of the Russian winters, and he knew what happened to the Grand Army of Napoleon back in 1812. With all that in mind, when it came time to leave, to depart in 41, we're going to see that he gains exactly 1 day. He leaves 1 day, does Hitler, before Napoleon a century earlier. So really, a bit of foreshadowing. Winter could be a problem here for Hitler in the same way as it was for the French and Napoleon years earlier. All right, guys, so I want to talk for a minute here, still making the comparison to Operation Barbarossa compared to Napoleon in 1812. Napoleon believed that symbolically, if he could control Moscow, the ancient capital. That's all he needed to do symbolically to achieve victory, was to take Moscow. Hitler had a little bit more of a broad-minded perspective as to how he wanted to approach this campaign. Now, he did want to take Moscow. It's now the capital city of not just the symbolic ancient capital, but it is the Soviet capital during this time period. He wants Moscow, but he also wants the most populous city of Leningrad. So he wants Leningrad, formerly called St. Petersburg, and today again called St. Petersburg. But he wants Leningrad, he wants Moscow, but he's also thinking a lot about resources as well. This is modern day warfare, this is industrial warfare certainly, based on technology. He needs resources, so he has one wave of attackers who go directly towards Moscow. He has another wave, or another prong, that are going to attack Leningrad. Then he has two additional prongs. One is going to attack what is known as the Ukraine. The Ukraine was significant because it was known for the production of grain, or wheat or grain. So it's the breadbasket of the USSR. 40% of the grain came from the Ukraine. He needs that land as well. And then lastly, he wants to take the Caucasus. The Caucasus mountain area, and you spell Caucasus C-A-U-C-A-S-U-S. The Caucasus contained 90%, I'll say it again for emphasis, 90% of the oil in the USSR. So his perspective is about cities and population, but also resources. He wants the Caucasus, and he also wants the Ukraine for its grain. Okay, let's discuss this, the onset of the military operation that becomes Barbarossa. Into the fall and the early winter of 1941, let's discuss the attack on Moscow, shall we? Let's look at Moscow a little bit. The same situation that happened to Napoleon is going to happen to Hitler's army as well. These guys just do not learn, it seems. So the same kind of scorched earth kind of philosophy is rolled out, unveiled, and used by the peasants and the people of the USSR against Hitler. So he's following the Russian peasants towards their capital city of Moscow, and along the way, it's the same thing all over again. It's like 1812 redo. They're burning crops, they're detonating bombs in small villages, they are overturning railroad tracks, they're collapsing bridges, they're making life miserable for the German army as they march their way towards the city of Moscow. So again, all kinds of problems for Germany, dealing with the civilian population walking or marching towards the city of Moscow. Upon getting there, upon arriving in Moscow, it's now later than they arrived, right? I mean, the foreshadowing was already there. This was prophetic. This was going to happen. History always repeats itself. So when they arrive in Moscow, it's later than expected. Again, it's an unusually cold and early and severe winter. Now, in his ego-driven mania, in his megalomania, get this, they believed, did Hitler and his cronies, his upper brass, that it would be a quick, decisive operation. They believed in a quick, decisive military campaign against the USSR. They brought 16 warm winter jackets for every 800 men. So 3.2 million men, they had 16 jackets per every 800 men. That means it's going to be bitter cold, very uncomfortable for Hitler's military power there stationed in Russia. As I said, it's an early cold winter. So before the end of 1941, we're going to see temperatures dip to -35, -40 degrees actual. -35, -40 degrees. So what conditions are going to plague Germany here in Moscow? One, I should mention again, the cold temperatures. It's obscenely cold for Germany in Moscow. Secondly, upon arrival in the capital city, we see, as I mentioned, more civilian involvement, protecting their mother Russia, their capital city. The women in Russia are going to dig trenches around the perimeter of the city. They dig trenches that are directed to be anti-tank trenches. So trenches cannot go down and back up again. They're stuck in these very deep trenches along the perimeter of Moscow. So we have women digging tank trenches. We have cold temperatures and lack of supplies. We're also going to see that because of the cold temperatures during the siege of Moscow, seemingly the German supplies do not work. What I'm alluding to here is that the rifles for Germany did not work, okay? Not too surprising. The German tanks would not run. They froze up. German tanks, German artillery, German guns all froze. But seemingly the Russian materials of war all still worked, okay, according to plan. So we believe today, and it's been documented, that the Russians had certain oils, secret oils they put into the gasoline, into the tanks, into the trucks, and the different supply wagons. So anyway, that's probably like antifreeze today, but the USSR had special oils they used to keep their machinery, their mechanization moving fluidly during the winter of 41 into 42. Long story short is that the turning point in the Moscow campaign, I would know this for sure for next Wednesday's quiz. The turning point was the arrival of a supply regiment under the leadership of a general who was very well respected, General Georgy Zhukov. Okay, so we're going to see the turning point in the Moscow campaign, the arrival of a well-respected commander named General Georgy Zhukov, Z-H-U-K-O-V. Now, I mentioned how exceedingly cold it is during the winter of 41. Do you have any guesses where Zhukov's regiments were stationed for really the entire campaign and prior to that? They were Zhukov's Siberian regiments, the coldest place on earth. So when they arrived in Moscow, they were like, I'm not sure what you're talking about. It's balmy here, it's beautiful, this is perfect Russian weather. So again, the arrival of Zhukov's troops, that turns the tables on Germany's army. Now I should mention right here that the German generals, Hitler's top military commanders, his upper brass, they have been warned, they have been told directly with no discretion, with a very forceful tone by Hitler, whatever you do, no matter how bad it might get while in the USSR, you never retreat, you do not turn around, you never surrender. Eventually, it got so ugly during the siege of Moscow that the military commanders made the decision that, hey, Hitler, the Fuhrer, is pretty out of his mind. We have no choice but to save the men that we can and begin this long, slow march back to Germany. Again, a la, very similar, reminiscent of Napoleon in 1812. So when they return back to salvage what they can and save lives, they are all promptly fired by Adolf Hitler, who names one individual the sole commander going forward of the German army, and that man was himself. After Moscow, he's going to fire his top military upper brass and name himself the sole commander-in-chief. So let's now shift gears a little bit and look at the year 1942. So Hitler is now in charge. You've got somebody who was a corporal in World War I who's now leading the entire army. Easy to say he's got mental health problems and makes rash, impulsive decisions. He looks to a different city for the next invasion, the next attack on Soviet Russia. The city of Stalingrad, S-T-A-L-I-N-G-R-A-D. So Stalingrad, S-T-A-L-I-N-G-R-A-D. Now, as I mentioned Stalingrad, I should mention there are two reasons why Hitler targets this one place on the map. Number one has to do with location or geopolitics. Stalingrad was an industrial hub right at the confluence of a couple of major rivers, one including the Volga, which was a really, really important river, obviously, and still is, for transportation and resources, and it's a very important thoroughfare or river for transportation then and today. So that's number one. But number two is a little bit more arbitrary, and it speaks of Hitler and his mindset a little bit. He attacked Stalingrad because it was the namesake of Joseph Stalin, his adversary. He's like, you know what, let's go there. It has the word Stalin in it. So let's turn our focus now to the summer of 1942 and the siege at Stalingrad, or the Battle of Stalingrad. And I would jot this down, folks, that it becomes the turning point in the European theater of World War II. So it's a turning point in the entire European theater of World War II, the Battle of Stalingrad. I should mention that before the German army arrived in Stalingrad, the city itself was forced to endure days upon days of aerial attacks by the Luftwaffe. So the Luftwaffe attacked Stalingrad before the arrival of the infantry, and they decimated 80% of the city. So 80% of Stalingrad, 80, was destroyed, decimated, in rubble upon the arrival of the German army. And strangely enough, guys, in a very odd twist of fate, we find that the destruction of the city was actually strangely a positive for the Soviets, for the people of Stalingrad, because there was a collapsed wall here, and that building was collapsed over there. The whole town was rubble. All of the military maps that had been offered up or prepared for the invasion were all useless. When Germany arrives in Stalingrad, it is a bloody mess. They can't pick out A to B. Where's the usual grid map of the city? They had no idea where they're going. So really here we're going to see at the Battle of Stalingrad that Germany was in uncharted, unknown territory, and they couldn't really see from A to B or find the right way to attack the enemy, who was everywhere. So 199 days of fighting during the siege of Stalingrad. 199 days, Germany versus the Soviet Red Army at Stalingrad. So ultimately, why do the Soviets hold? Why do they win? Why do they expel and push backwards the German army? Let's discuss this a little bit. The reasons here are several. I mentioned one already, simply civilian participation, civilian involvement. The people of Stalingrad fight like, it means their life. They fight as if Mother Russia, the motherland, is the most important thing to them, okay? They've got interlopers on their turf, and they fight like mad to expel the interloper. So we have Russian factory workers, and by day they work the entire day making munitions, making bombs, making guns. And during their lunch break, what do? They go out into the streets of Stalingrad and they take on German soldiers hand on hand. There's all kinds of anecdotes here from Stalingrad about Russian citizens, factory workers, shoemakers, bartenders, who actually spend their lunch break and their after hours in the evening fighting independently or fighting one-on-one, man-on-man against the German army. So number one has to do with civilian involvement by the Soviet citizens in Stalingrad. Number two, very important, just mention again the idea of commitment. Let me say it again, the moral commitment of the people of Russia. They had never beaten Germany in a war. And again, they had been duped by Hitler and by the Nazi-Soviet Pact. The moral commitment by Mother Russia was ignored by Hitler. He didn't understand how bad they wanted to protect their land. I should mention this, and it's pretty important, is that when the campaign began, Joseph Stalin is going to issue what is known today as Military Order 227. Let me say it slowly for you. Military Order 227, which said essentially no step back. No one steps backward. There is no surrender. There is no retreat. Military Order 227 was based upon the adage, not one step backwards. And really there was still this humiliating memory of World War I and the fact that the Russians had caved in, capitulated, had run, had given up. And so Stalin made sure that in World War II and during Barbarossa, both at Moscow and at Stalingrad, not one step back. And the people took it very seriously. The people of Russia took this seriously, and it applied to civilians and to military personnel. If you retreated, you were killed as a traitor as a result. Okay, so number three, the third reason for the success, we should talk about manpower. Okay, quite simply, the Soviet army is massive, and they're going to overpower ultimately the German army at Stalingrad. Okay, and one last thing I'll mention about the Soviet victory at Stalingrad, and we'll get to the long-term impact. The final reason for Stalin's big victory and the Soviet victory at the Battle of Stalingrad has to do with their experiences as a communist nation. As a communist country, they had gone through two different 5-year plans under Joseph Stalin. A 5-year plan in the 30s under Stalin meant essentially rationing, going without, giving up what belonged to you for the good of the communist state to try to catch the West. They were trying to give up their own materials to catch the military and the industrial output of the English and the French in the countries in the West. Long story short is that they were uniquely qualified and experienced giving up creature comforts for the good of a cause. They were easily shaped or created into a giving country, a giving unit. Okay, they were convinced quite easily by Stalin to give to the cause. So their moral commitment to Mother Russia perseveres. So ultimately, guys, the campaign at Stalingrad is a disaster. You're going to see the images later on Schoology. You'll see how the course of destruction through the city. And I wanted to mention before I go today, the impact here is very, very important. Now, the city is destroyed. We understand that. The German 6th Army is encircled and they're forced to surrender. The rest of the army retreats again back to Germany, to the west. 2 million combined lives are lost at the Battle of Stalingrad. 2 million lives. So it's a destructive, it's a devastating stain on humanity, that many lives being lost during one conflict. Let's look at the long term, actually the short term and the long term impact. So the short term influence or impact is that now who goes on the forefront, who gains the power in terms of the Allies. Of course, shortly after, Stalin and the USSR now belong to the Triple Allies, or the Americans, the English, the French. After the Battle of Stalingrad, who now wields the most power within the Allies as an institution, as an alliance? Russia. So we're going to see that Joseph Stalin now goes on the offensive. The following year, we're going to see a meeting of great consequence called the Tehran Conference. So the next year, we have the Tehran Conference, T-E-H-R-A-N. T-E-H-R-A-N, the Tehran Conference. And you've got 3 very important men who meet at Tehran to discuss the future of the war. So at the Tehran Conference, you've got FDR, the American president, of course. You've got Winston Churchill, the English prime minister. And of course, you've got Joseph Stalin for the Russians. And again, let me ask you, who wields the most power at the Tehran Conference? He has defeated Hitler and his war machine. He has turned them back. He has changed the entire course of the war in Europe. And Stalin knows this. He goes to Tehran very confident and full of bluster and ego. And he says to these 2 gentlemen, his allies, the English and the Americans, you will now give to us. You will recognize the ultimate sacrifice made by the Russian troops and our civilians and by me. he's going to ask for at Tehran and receive in 1944 a very important offensive in Western Europe to recognize the debt paid by the USSR. Stalin's going to ask for from his allies, America and England, what becomes the D-Day invasion of 1944. Quickly, a couple more things to mention about Stalingrad. What is maybe in terms of the course of the war, the most crucial, the most pivotal result of Stalingrad is that it completely influences Germany's military plan as well as Hitler's psyche. Because they're stuck at Stalingrad, they go back to the West. Now, if they had won at Stalingrad, they being Germany, they would have kept going eastward and met up probably with Japan, their allies in the Far East, and that's a big problem for the Allies. So in terms of the war plan and strategy, they're forced to go back. They cannot meet up with Japan. But back to Hitler's psyche. As a result of this defeat at Stalingrad, Hitler loses a certain level of invincibility. He loses his confidence, he loses his bluster, he loses his mojo. He is never the same again during World War II because of the loss of his edge. A couple more things. Because of Stalingrad, the USSR, going forward the remainder of the 20th century, always had a fear of the West. They had a fear of outsiders. They had a fear of outside invasion. And it really helps to sort of shape or sculpt some of the negativity and the suspicion that Soviet leaders had of America, England, France, and the West going forward. They always fear the West. They always suspect an invasion and that the Americans and the English are plotting against them. It does shape foreign relations of the next 50 years. It provides a platform and a basis for the Cold War still to come. If you go today to Stalingrad, it goes by the name today Volgograd as a result of the revelation in the future of Stalin's atrocities, his gulag system, his purging of Russian soldiers. It changed the name to Volgograd, but if you go there today, they have kept it very similar to how things would have looked back in the 1940s as a testimony. I mean, it's been rebuilt and there's new buildings and such, but there's new buildings juxtaposed next to old crumbling structures from 1942 and 43. So you see these crumbling buildings next to shiny new glassy buildings. You see maybe a Porsche or a Maserati, a brand new car, parked next to a 1940s World War II era tank. As they've kept a strange juxtaposition. It's like going to Rome and seeing the Colosseum next to a UDF or something. So they've kept these memories alive as a reminder, do not trust your former opponents, your foes from the 1940s. Last thing, guys, there is an amazing sculpture that you'll see tonight later on in my imagery called The Motherland Calls. The Motherland Calls is a massive structure that overlooks the city of Volgograd. It was constructed in 1967. At the time, it was the largest sculpture in the world. And again, it symbolizes the grit, determination, and refusal to give up of the Soviet citizens as well as the army during World War II. Today, it's no longer the biggest statue in the world, but it is the largest statue still today in Europe. It's also the largest statue from pedestal to the tip of the sword, 729 feet, the largest statue of a woman anywhere in the world still today. All right, guys, have a great evening. Thanks for your time. Be well. Thank you.